Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Jag Bhalla. He's the author of the book, I'm Not Hanging Noodles on Your Ears, but more importantly, he is a science writer, contributor to Scientific American and to Current Affairs, where he has written a number of excellent and important pieces, mostly on the climate crisis. His most recent for us is Climate Optimism is Dangerous and Irrational. Previously, he wrote, We Can't Have Climate Justice Without Ending Computational Colonialism, a concept which we will get into today. And before that, he wrote the excellent piece, Taming the Greedocracy. We will surely be speaking about greedocracy today. So, Jag Bhalla, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Nathan. And thank you for publishing this is now my fifth piece. And many of those pieces could not have been published elsewhere. So thank you for that.
Well, that's what we ask writers, to bring us the stuff that everyone else rejects for being too off the wall, too detailed, too whatever it is. So, by the way, those listening, if you have a piece that's getting rejected everywhere, but you think it's really, really important, come to Current Affairs. And Jag, one of the reasons I like your pieces for us is that, you know, when you write on this subject, you know, you're a math guy, so you have all the numbers, all the facts, all the stats. But what I like about the way you write about the climate crisis is that you come to it with what I consider the requisite or required level of human moral outrage. And so maybe we could start with that, the particular tone in which you write your articles and why.
Yes, and in fact, it ties in nicely with the business of climate optimism, which is right there in the title of the last piece. And one of the lines in that piece is that I say that my main objection to climate optimism as practiced by, for example, the likes of Ezra Klein, is that it prioritizes the resource usage towards elite comforts over protecting the poor. One of the big challenges with climate is that we have to allocate humanity's available resources, portion the amount of carbon we have left, as well as other kinds of ecologically constrained resources, and determine how they are used. And for example, Ezra Klein, in his advocating of techno-optimism, expresses the idea that you allowed me to call this repugnant optimism, by the way, in a recent piece. And he expresses the idea that it's politically not possible to have any kind of a climate program that doesn't represent visions of more for the global elite, which is to say, Mr. Klein's leadership. And so what this ends up doing is that this ends up shortchanging our commitments to protecting the most vulnerable people on the planet, who, by the way, have done the least to...
Well, yeah. I think if we could go into a little more detail about that, because that's a critical point here that it comes up in many of your pieces, which is who is causing the climate disaster. And, you know, you break down the income levels across the world, and you show us, you know, what people actually make. And most of the world does not make very much money, and most of the world does not contribute very much to carbon emission. And it's actually quite staggering when you look at, you know, the percentage of this problem that is caused by a very, very small number of people. It seems to me a lot of your analysis begins with trying to get us to grapple with, to recognize when we're talking about this massive problem, who is doing what to whom.
Extremely important. And so, for example, the billion plus people in Africa have contributed less than 0.5% historic carbon emissions since we started putting that pollutant into the atmosphere. One way to address the question you're asking here is to look and examine the term Anthropocene. The construction of that term suggests that it's humanity that is causing this problem. And as you point out, a small fraction of humans who are causing this problem. The bulk of the planet's poor have done almost nothing to contribute to this. in my very first piece, Taming Greedocracy, I referred to this as being more accurately called the Capitalocene or the Greedocene. So the global elite, the global top 10%, cause almost 50% of all emissions. Global bottom 10% cause essentially a negligible amount. There is no constraint on gains in resource usage by the global poor that will have an impact on overall emissions. Emissions are driven enormously by elite consumption. In fact, a point that you've allowed me to make, which I haven't seen made in almost anywhere else, is that the UN Environmental Programme, the World Inequality Lab, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, or at least the science parts of it, have all explicitly stated we need, in order to meet the targets that the world has set itself, to have curbs on elite consumption. It's extremely important to note that they don't just say curbs on elite carbon, because the fastest way to curb carbon is to reduce consumption. Cuts in over excessive use of resources can be instant. We saw that in COVID, for example. But things like building out a new green energy infrastructure will take decades. Right. I know you, Nathan, are you like the idea from Professor Henry Shue, in his book about us being the pivotal generation, which is to say, we do this decade is extremely important. And so anything that takes decades to do isn't really going to help. So rebuilding our green infrastructure, switching everything to electric vehicles, etc., these are all necessary and important, but they're not going to impact the overall problem in the short term. There's actually only one way to impact the problem in the short term at scale. You allowed me to call this, in a prior piece, elite austerity, which is to say consumption cuts targeted at the global elite, the global top 10%. And since you mentioned numbers, to help the audience put this into context, the global top 10% is everybody who makes above $53,000 in 2021. 85% of humanity lives on less than the US federal poverty line. So if you are in any way above a destitute level in the global north, you're already near the top 10% of the planet's resources.
That's very strange that you say that 85% live below the federal poverty line, because Steven Pinker told me that capitalism and modernity had lifted humanity out of poverty.
This is an astonishingly appalling state of affairs that actually, until I started looking into this in detail, I also believe the general, not just Pinker, but many people in the air will assert that capitalism is ending global poverty and has done a brilliant job and lifted billions in cash. Somebody, I'm forgetting who, in The Guardian, described this as humanity's greatest ever achievement. And do you know what the technical definition of escaping extreme poverty is? It's rising above a consumption level of, at the time Steven Pinker made that comment, it was $1.90 a day. It's now been increased to the princely sum of $2.15 a day, which is to say that spending as much as we would spend on a corporate coffee without even blinking counts as escaping terrible conditions, right? So having no more resources than we spend on a cup of coffee in a given day, for some reason, by Steven Pinker and his pals, considered a celebration-worthy escape from global poverty. I did the calculations actually for an early piece in this, and that 190 a day is 1/19th of the US federal poverty line.
I, too, did not realize just what a fraud this idea that the global poverty has been massively alleviated is. And when you realize it, when you see it, when you start to notice it, and you see how the trick works, it's just a trick. It's like if you have a nickel and I take your nickel and I give you a dime and I say I've doubled your income. That's basically what the capitalism has lifted people out of poverty is. That's what it amounts to.
And the mechanisms for how it's achieved are very interesting. Depending on how much exposure you have to the global poverty discourse, a great deal of it centers around this thing called the Gini coefficient, which enables you to focus, in effect, on percentage changes rather than absolute changes. You can, in fact, double somebody's low income for an extremely small amount, right? In a percentage terms, that looks fantastic. in concrete resource terms, it doesn't. One tiny point to make is that number, the $1.90 a day, is purchasing parity power adjusted. So it's literally the equivalent, roughly as you can do in these estimates, to spending that amount of money in the US. Right? So some people, when they hear this, are, oh yeah, but everything's cheap in Bangladesh. And that's not what's going on here. The global poor have not contributed to climate change, but they are being asked to bear the burden of consequences in a very insidious way. The computational colonialism piece that you published, not the climate optimism piece, reported on some work by Indian researchers by the name of Tejal Kanetkar. And one of the things she did was look at, in the IPCC's models, which are the subject of the last piece, at what they assume about global inequality. And for example, the core IPC scenarios project that in 2050, so a generation from now, almost 30 years from now, sub-Saharan Africans on average per capita will have 4.6% of the consumption of a North American, 30 years from now. And in those 3 decades, 14 times more per capita will be used to enhance your and my lifestyles rather than to fix the dire needs of sub-Saharan Africans. Yeah. Not only are those kinds of inequities built into IPCC modeling, but the way the models are constructed, the values that are put into the models that shape what comes out, a greater burden of mitigation impact is going to fall on global health.
Right. So to understand this a little more, when we talk about the possible solutions to or ways of dealing with climate change, a lot of those that are put forth, or almost all of those that are the mainstream climate solutions, essentially assume that the global poor will have to stay poor, because if the global poor started consuming at the kind of level of the United States, I forget the statistic, but we'd have to have like 5 Earths or, many, many more Earths. So essentially, we have to maintain something roughly equivalent to the current level of income distribution to contain climate change, or else we would have to consider sharp cuts to consumption among global elites, which, as you point out, is essentially treated at the outset as something we have to reject in considering any solution. So basically, the premise of any possible mainstream solution is you can't substantially curtail the consumption habits of the global top 10%.
Well, it's even worse, I'm afraid.
Oh, no.
It's not that you can't adjust, you can't constrain at all, right? This is Ezra Klein's no sacrifice position, right? He thinks it's politically unrealistic to offer people a vision of less rather than more. And you allowed me to say on the Rainforest Records piece that what Klein is doing, and similar climate optimists, is somehow assuming that political reality can trump the reality of physics. The sentence I like that you let me off the leash a little bit in that piece was that climate physics doesn't give the tiniest quark-sized shit about elite feelings or political realism, right?
Right.
This is a physics-constrained situation we're in. But you make some very important connections there. And one of the interesting things that I address in the climate optimism piece is why most people who even pay any attention to climate issues don't know how differently economists treat climate concerns to how physical scientists do. In essence, physical scientists are telling us that we're nearing very significant thresholds that could cause all sorts of problems, and we need to be acting as aggressively as possible. In contrast, economists, generally speaking, for example, I quote 2 in the piece, both Richard Toll, who in a review of macroeconomic literature on climate impacts says, and I quote, "Impacts on human welfare will be minimal in the 21st century." So they are minimizing the potential consequences. And the other person that I quote and whose work I look at extensively in the piece is William Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize in 2018 for this work. And in fact, his latest update of his model, which is called estimates that at the centigrade temperature increase global average would result in only 3.6% reduction in global GDP. How he achieves these kinds of estimates is a great part of the latest piece, the climate optimism piece, because very fortuitously, in a way, we got to see what the techniques that he uses can do in a different area in the COVID pandemic. The kind of model that Nordhaus uses, and a technique called curve fitting, was described when it was used in a COVID model by a Trump White House economists as amateur hour. And a leading commentator on mathematical modeling by the name of Kathy O'Neill, author of the book Weapons of Math Destruction, said of this technique that curve fitting has led to some spectacularly stupid projections.
Right. And so that Trump model that you put in your piece, they essentially extrapolated out from some existing trend to show that COVID this was in early 2020, to show that it would go away very soon, wouldn't be too much of a problem. But the economists use that technique, but they also, a lot of this seems to come down to what you measure and what you don't. It seems that a lot of the critique of the economic models that suggest, well, climate change isn't going to do that much damage. I read this in the Wall Street Journal op-ed page all the time. Bjorn Lomborg argues this, where they say, well, it's climate change is going to cause a 3% hit to the GDP. That's all very manageable. There's absolutely no need to do very much. And I take it that some of this is just that economists, first off, the ways that they're predicting trends, but there's also the fact that they're just not measuring a ton of things that actually have value.
Yes, the number of ways in which this is poor technique for attempting to make the decisions we're trying to make is extremely long. I'm just trying to think about how best to look at this. The framework within which economists themselves view this is through what's called externalities. These do come up in other areas. You may have encountered them before, but I think this is actually it just doesn't fit for climate. A good way to think about a phrase that captures some intelligence here is that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the biosphere. The biosphere isn't a minor externality that we can price in, is the way economists will look at it. It is the container for everything that economics does. And it is no way represented in the prices of commodities that we trade in. And actually, by the way, I think decisions on climate policy shouldn't be made on a cost-benefit basis. Right. We started this conversation with you pointing out that I like to address these issues from a moral dimension rather than a monetary dimension. There should be no gain that you could potentially make that would justify damaging the sacred object that sustains our lives. This isn't even something you can do sensibly. Interestingly, some scientists are coming around to this point of view, as in fact are some economists. Lord Nicholas Stern, who is himself a climate economist, said cost-benefit analysis is just the wrong way to address this problem.
Well, let's go a little more into why your piece is about climate optimism. There are a lot of people, even who ostensibly worry about climate change. Of course, there are those who downplay the extent of the problem of climate change. There are the Republicans who just say that it's not happening, and if it is happening, it's not going to do very much. But then there are plenty of people in this country who say they take the problem very, very seriously, but who have been sympathetic to or adopted this climate optimism perspective that says, well, it's quite manageable. Well, how would you summarize what climate optimism is? What is it? What is the position that you're responding to in this piece?
That's a very good question. One way to frame this is through the work of, say, Rebecca Solnit or Susan Nyman, who's the philosopher who I mentioning this, or in fact Terry Eagleton, who both Solnit and Eagleton have written books about what optimism means and drawing distinctions between optimism and hope. And both Solnit and Nyman and Eagleton all describe optimism as having the same epistemic problem as pessimism. It essentially depends on a blanket assumption that you know what's going to happen in the future. In the case of the optimists, they think things are going to turn out well without knowing why or how. And likewise for pessimists. And both Solnit and Eagleton recommend hope over optimism. Hope is where you engage with the reality of a situation and make concerted efforts to change it towards a better outcome, whereas climate optimism tends to be a just hand-waving idea that innovation and technology and markets will solve this problem, and therefore we can feel good about the situation and don't really have to think hard about how best to adapt. I'm not sure if that was a good definition.
Yeah. So in terms of thinking, about what the takeaways that I want people to get out of your pieces are, and they may be different from what you want people to get out of your pieces, but the things that, that compel me about your writing for Current Affairs is that I think that you help us confront some of the things that are left out consistently of the discourse around the climate crisis. And so one of the points that you make, and I've sort of hinted at this earlier, is, for everything that we're talking about doing, we have to think about, well, what does it do for whom? And there are lots of things that look like solutions that are, quote, solutions for some people, whereas they consign other people to misery and death. I see a lot of rhetoric from these climate optimists and the techno-optimists about climate change isn't apocalyptic, okay, for example. There is a book by Michael Schellenberger called Apocalypse Never. And when I see that stuff and I take this framework of thinking, well, okay, but for whom? Michael Schellenberger means it's apocalypse never for me, Michael Schellenberger, a wealthy Westerner. But if you're in Pakistan, where there were these just horrific climate exacerbated floods last year that, wiped away millions of homes, it's not only apocalypse, soon, it's now, right? These apocalyptic conditions exist for many people, and we're just, but if you shut those people out, and if you shut out the question of what justice would be in a situation where a small percentage of the global population is causing the problem and a much larger percentage of the global population is on the receiving end of the problem, you have to shut all of those things out that you don't let us shut out in your writing in order to get to this optimistic position.
Yes. It just occurred to me that a good way to summarize what the optimistic position is in the titles of the two articles that I write against in this piece, one of which is by David Wallace Wells, who wrote a piece back last October called Beyond Catastrophe. And then in March of this year, Harper's Magazine ran a cover story, the title of which was The Incredible Disappearing Doomsday, How the Media Stopped Worrying About Climate. And that's the tone of optimism. It's, hey, it's not such a big deal. As you point out, people like Schellenberger are saying that it's not going to be apocalyptic. We can get into why that logic has arisen. But as you point out, it is already being severely hampering and damaging to large numbers of the global poor. And they are left out of the table. In a spicy bit of language, you allowed me to say in this last piece that this way of thinking, and it's certainly the stuff that's captured in the IPCC economic models, in effect treats the global poor as disposable non-player characters in rich people YOLO adventures. That's what we're doing here. We're deciding how much thrills and luxury we should enjoy while the global poor suffer extra burdens because of the carbon and other ecological impacts our adventure travel is having, for example. Looked at fairly, it's just unconscionable that this is what's going on.
Well, and I want to talk briefly about the article you did on it's called the 1%, far worse than the rainforest wrecker, many times worse than the rainforest wreckers. The point of which is that we talk in discussions about the climate and environment a lot about the Amazon, and we must stop the deforestation of the Amazon, which you agree with. You think the deforestation of the Amazon is bad, but you highlight the fact that in terms of the destruction done, elite consumption is just far worse than the destruction of the entire Amazon would be.
Actually, I hadn't seen calculated in any press article before. In order to offset the carbon produced by the global 1%, you would need between 6 and 9 Amazons.
Yeah.
And the thing that triggered me to write that piece was the frenetic concern for the rainforest expressed by the New York Times. This was shortly before the elections in Brazil, with language like, the planet is doomed if the election goes the wrong way. The Amazon is the lungs of the planet. But it turns out that the personal consumption of the readers of the New York Times were more than all of the carbon that the Amazon absorbs. So the US has half of all global top 1%ers, and there's a very good chance that a substantial chunk of them are New York Times readers. And the New York Times readership is about 10 million subscribers at the moment. So it's entirely likely that the lifestyles of New York Times readers has a worse impact on the planet than if Bolsonaro clear-cut the entire Amazon. In narrow terms, this is in terms of carbon. Obviously, there's a lot of ecological and hydrological, etc., changes. But it's just this mismatch between concern for the Amazon and lack of regard for what overconsumption in our lifestyles is doing to the Amazon.
Well, yes. In the United States, I think it's safe to say there is a great reluctance to face, even among liberal and left commentators on climate change, a great reluctance to entertain the notion that people in this extremely wealthy country might have to have less. They might have to, they might have to give something up. The idea is that is, as you said, politically unrealistic, but the question should not be whether it's politically realistic. The question should be, as you mentioned, what does physics say about what is possible? And, obviously, unless we are going to maintain huge levels of inequality, I mean, if anyone else, as we've said, consumed at the levels that we do, the catastrophe would be far, far worse. In getting us to a place where we can start to think of realistic and fair solutions or paths forward, a lot of the criticism of the points that you make in this piece suggests that it's often targeted at what is called the degrowth movement, who say that GDP shouldn't be the measure of all value, and maybe we actually need less GDP in certain places in certain respects. What are we talking about, though, when we are talking about elite consumption? We haven't really taken it apart. So let's talk about what the worst things that we do are that are most destructive, and what we would actually need to have less of in order to move forward in a way that is not destructive and that does not hog the planet's resources.
The best way for me to answer that question is using the work of Professor Julian Allwood, who is a professor of engineering at the University of Cambridge in England. And he says there are 4 main areas that you should focus on, one of which is he actually says we should stop flying, but obviously we should at least minimize flying and ultimately may need to stop it if we can't get overall carbon under control. But it's flying, beef, your car, and how you heat your house, heat and cool your home. Those are the 4 main areas that we can individually make significant changes potentially on. But so what this really means is things like SUVs are just not a sustainable way to drive around. Flying several times a year is not sustainable. Eating beef at the levels that we are now is not sustainable. A shocking statistic in that area, which I include in several of my pieces is that 78% of global farming land is dedicated to raising and feeding beef. So it's actually a good way to see how irrational markets are in allocating resources, or how immoral actually is another good word to use there. Mark Pittman, in his History of the World Food System, describes this as corporate immoralism. So while over 2 billion humans are undernourished, 78% of land that's used for farming purposes is used actually to fatten beef that's sold to the rich. And while rich nation pets have more food security than 1 in 3 humans. This is what comes out of using markets to allocate the most fundamental resource that humans need to live, i.e. food. It's entirely irrational, also immoral, also not sustainable. We have to do a much better job of allocating resources rationally and morally, would be my main argument. So you've asked essentially about what kind of lifestyle changes might be necessary. Another good angle on this is provided by the work of Jason Hickel, who has observed, for example, that Spain in Europe, a nice European country, very nice lifestyle, beats America on almost all social metrics. Like, for example, their life expectancy is 5 years longer than America's, but they do it on 50% less GDP per capita and 70% less carbon per capita.
Yeah, and I don't think anyone would say that Spain, having visited Spain once and thought, my God, I want to move here. I don't think anyone would say this is, you could call this eco-austerity.
No, there's as I say, it's quite clear, and what we need is elite austerity, constraints on excessive elite consumption, and everybody else can have a decent lifestyle.
Right.
By the way, the elite can have a decent lifestyle too.
Yeah, you're right. Everyone. Yeah.
So everyone can have a decent lifestyle. And you asked earlier about things that are not included in the way economists look at these kind of calculations, of cost-benefit calculations. And one of the things that shockingly isn't included, for example, is the likelihood of resource wars. Julian Allwood's work notes that if we don't radically alter temperature trajectory, approximately 1 billion people. So the costs of those kinds of impacts are not in economic impact models that the IPCC uses, or that won William Nordhaus that Nobel Prize. Wars, famine, drought, refugees, impacts of this type are not factored into those models. The reason for the last article, Climate Optimism article, was those 2 pieces in the New York Times and Harper's, which painted a very rosy picture and suggested that the media has stopped worrying about climate. But the optimism of those writers is based on a partial understanding of what's in IPCC models and what's implausible that's in those models. So a great source of this newfound optimism in the climate pundit community is the work of Roger Pilkey and Justin Ritchie, who over a number of years have steadily increased awareness that core IPCC scenarios, in particular one called RCP 8.5, you don't need to worry about the acronyms, but that's just the label, uses as an assumption an implausible amount of coal. It actually has, at the end of the century, in 2100, 6 times the amount of coal being burned as is currently burned now. Now, it seems extremely unlikely that will happen, and when Pilkey and Ritchie published papers on this, there's people in the climate pundit community were overjoyed, because what this means now is it's extremely unlikely that the high end of the temperature range could occur. So this is why they are saying things like disappearing doomsday, beyond catastrophe, because now a temperature range potential of 4 to 5 degrees looks more like it will be 2 to 3 degrees rather than 4 to 5. So in their heads, this is an improvement. This is great. 2 and 3 might still be bad, but it's not as bad as 4 and 5. So whoopee, let's celebrate. But what they are also not paying attention to is other enormously implausible things that are assumed in IPCC models. In particular, and neither Wallace Wells nor the Harper's guy mention carbon capture at all. But in order to balance, or as you allow me to say in this last article, to cook the books and the biosphere, the IPCC puts into their models an enormous, known to be not viable amount of carbon capture or negative emissions technology. I both quote an IPCC expert and actually provide a link to him saying this on camera. This chap's name is Anant Padwardhan, and he says to the camera at an IPCC side meeting COP panel, he says, "We are encouraged to believe that models are truth machines, but they are not. An enormous amount of negative emissions technology is put into the models without making it clear that it's just not feasible at the scales in the models."
Yeah.
Right. So while the pundit community is overjoyed that we're not going to use as much coal as RCP 8.5 imagines, we're also almost guaranteed to not be able to suck as much carbon out of the air as the models also assume.
Right.
And by the way, allow me to go on at length about this in the article. That's not even the only thing missing from the models. Models do not include an enormous number of other known geophysical feedbacks and political and social and economic impacts that are likely. We mentioned, for example, refugees. Articles like the Times Beyond Catastrophe and Harper's article as grounds for optimism. You are being misinformed. And a question I raised in my optimism rebuttal article is the logical possibilities here seem to be that climate editors and climate writers either don't know about all these emissions and problems, or they know about them and don't think they're important enough to mention to their readers. And neither of those gives me confidence in these people steering us wisely and sensibly through the enormous crisis that we're facing.
Right. Which is why I hope that all of our listeners, if they have not already, will turn to the pages of Current Affairs and read your piece on why climate optimism is dangerous and irrational. You go through, you explain what the models leave out, you explain the assumptions that they make about the kinds of technologies that we will be able to develop and the ways in which this is a form of magical thinking. But you do not come to a conclusion that we are all doomed. Instead, as you say, instead of climate optimism, what we need is we need the determination to actually face reality. What's that quote from James Baldwin you have in the piece? It's really good.
Love that quote. He says, "Not everything that can be faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced."
Yes, beautiful.
And that's one of the things that climate optimism is doing. It's discouraging us from facing the realities that are encircling us. It's interesting to note that we're having this conversation 4 or 5 months after the piece was initially written. And even in those 4 or 5 months, a great many impacts have occurred that are worse than were imagined 4 or 5 months ago. One of the climate books that I've read since writing this piece is called The Heat Will Kill You First by Jeff Goodell. It's an excellent book. And one of the things that struck me in reading it is 2 of the world's leading climate experts on heat waves say on the record that we do not understand heat waves. We can't predict how extreme they're going to be, even in the short term, never mind the long term. For example, in 2021, the Antarctic experienced a heat wave in which the temperature jumped from its previous normal range by 70 degrees centigrade. And the point of mentioning it now is those kinds of impacts are not handled by global average temperatures in IPCC models. And those kinds of changes can have enormous impact. So this week, for example, you're probably aware, there's an enormous heat dome in the center of the country, center of America right now. And first, the scientists who say, mention that we don't really understand heat waves and our model particularly well, say that it's not out of the question that a city will experience a heat wave in which the peak temperature is 5 to 10 degrees centigrade above previous experiences. And either of those could be catastrophic. It could happen anywhere in the world. and it could be catastrophic. Jeff, in his book, notes that and expresses concern that we might have the equivalent of a heat Katrina, which is to say a heat dome occurring in a place, say, for example, like Phoenix, where it's so bad that the grid gets knocked out and air conditioning fails. And in such a scenario, you could see tens of thousands of deaths, in a rich nation city. So these kinds of impacts haven't been planned for. They're not in the models. And
right.
Having an optimistic attitude to the future, where this means optimism in the media is behaving as a filtering mechanism. If a story doesn't have a feel-good tone to it, it's generally pushed out of sight, repressed, not reported on.
Right.
That guarantees that we will not have the information we need to face the problems. It fails the Baldwin test. Can't solve what you're not facing.
Right. Well, you help us face this reality squarely, so people should read Climate Optimism is Dangerous and Irrational, as well as the previous pieces that you've written for Current Affairs. Each one of them is perennially relevant. I don't think any of them have dated, so they should start with Taming the Greedocracy. They should read Computational Colonialism. These are very, very helpful to understanding the way the world works. So, Jag Bhalla, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
No, thank you, Nathan, for publishing those pieces and for having this conversation. And I will just end on this one note. As I say in that last piece, there is an enormous amount that we can and should do to make the future better. But as you have tried to make clear in this conversation, we have to prioritize those who are in the greatest need first, which is the global poor. And our future is in our hands, but we should address that future facing the new material and moral constraints that science has been telling us about for decades now. It's time to bravely and courageously do the right thing.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.